Don't you dare approach Mikula the Kind. Needle Knight Leader, Dryleaf Dane, and our ally will never allow this.
Martial arts are one of Elden Ring's new weapon types, and by using them, you can kill a fuck-off dragon by kicking it in its face. And since that's the only motivation I needed, here we are, back at the base game, on a mission to get to the dojo as soon as possible. I followed my standard setup guide to grab all of the early upgrades, and you do want both the smithings and the sombers for this run. I cheesed the cavalry and killed Grail without using the bleed grease from the setup, then grabbed these levels. So last week it was the Reduvia. Now for another great contender for getting to the DLC early. Old Reliable itself, Bloodhound's Fang. Kill the Bloodhound by spamming square off at him and level up our trusty blade to +6. Now for a couple of bits. First to Fort Gale for Flame Grant Me Strength. Then up to Mount Gelmir for Golden Vow. Then back to Weeping Peninsula to grab the Faith Tier so we can use it. Finally, although there is no need for parrying on this run, if you're a parry nerd and you can't resist, to the Merchant for a small shield. So for our first boss, Noble. If you're less experienced with the game, feel free to do as much as you like of the base game before this. But as you can see, Bloodhound's Fang absolutely shreds Noble. We're doing Noble here not just for the Somber 7, but also the Dagger Talisman. After the fight, a quick run through the manor to grab our couple of bits. And with one of the best weapons in the game at +9, Radahn's in for a bit of a rough time. Head to the Walking Mausoleum, dupe Radahn's Remembrance, buy rune arcs with any spare change you have, then to the abandoned cave in Caelid for the Golden Scarab. And finally, blast through Vare's questline to get the medal for early access to Mogwins. When you get there, as usual, ride around and grab all the good runes in the Blood River. The Lord's Rune and the Smithing 8s in the cave. Then finally, the Ancient Somber in the chest. If you're not super comfortable with Moog, I'd recommend making a save file before the fight so you can keep the blood grease, as it makes this one a lot easier. The idea here is to keep him locked in the countdown animation while you spam R1 to proc bleed and build stagger. I accidentally used the bleed grease instead of healing between the first and second knee heal, and it worked out really well as it animation cancelled it and allowed me to heal through the second and third while having the buff active for phase 2. So I'd highly recommend this as a strat. However, if you're looking at this thinking that's a whole ton of phase 2, there is a solution. It just requires a little bit more time. If you grab the Purifying Tear, which you can get by killing Eleonora at the Second Church of Marika after finishing Yura's questline, you can spam your way through Nihil and set up another stagger right at the start of phase 2, meaning you only have to dodge a couple of attacks at the most. In the Realm of Shadow, I followed the first part of my DLC setup guide to get us to Erdtree level 9. Right at the start, you may as well grab the Blade of Mercy from the Scorched Ruins. We'll be using it much later. On your way through the setup, make sure you grab the Monk's Missive and the Gesture by Leda at the High Road Cross. When you're all set, meet Dane at the Morth Ruins and perform the gesture. Now it was smithing stone time. I wanted to see whether it was possible to max out the Dryleaf Arts before fighting anything else. I had enough for plus 16 from the base game setup, but I'd need to find the rest in the DLC. So first to the ruined forge of Starfall Past. There's a smithing 6 in the first room, then another in the room with the smithing talisman, then drop down into the second room for the smithing 8s on the body. Then up to the top of the Fort of Reprimand for some 8s. Then to the basement for 6s. For the 7s, we head to the Fog Rift Fort, running past Lizard Tongue Man to grab them from the chest. Then to the Ruined Forge Lava Intake. There's 3 smithing 7s on this body just after you run up the broken wall, and an ancient smithing from the forge at the end. Now we need 1 more smithing 7 and 1 more smithing 8. And rather pleasingly, both of these can be found on top of the giant skull in Fort Farith. I've always thought these stones being here was completely pointless, but happily, there's now a reason to grab them. Get the talisman pouch from Enya at the round table, and now we've hit level 76, we're about ready to fight Margit. So if you've not used this weapon before, you'll fast discover that there isn't a single attack in the moveset that isn't incredibly usable. The R1 combo comes out super quick and is brilliant for punishing tiny gaps. And the jumping attacks are very useful for closing distance. Now for what became my favourite combo on this weapon though, the charged R2 attack. The 2-part chargey and the follow-up does great damage and posture damage per second, especially with the Spike Cracked here and the Axe Talisman active. With Godric down, I went up to the tower for the Great Rune. Now, if you're going for the classic Tekken 3 look on your martial arts character like me, you can get your weight limit incredibly low on this build. So I jumped off the Saints Bridge and headed down into the High Road Cave to grab the blue dancer charm. Let's quickly talk about a talisman that I didn't use on this run, but that you might want to. The Shattered Stone talisman, which you can find in the Morth Ruins, boosts the power of kick attacks by 10%. I didn't use it as the blue dancer charm will be doing very slightly more for me on this build, but from my testing they're incredibly similar. So if you wanted to do a medium load version of this build with decent armor, just replace the blue dancer charm with that and you'll see virtually the same damage. And to keep that weight as low as possible, back to Volcano Manor to grab the Erdtree seal. Now to clear out Raya Lucaria, which isn't exactly what you'd call a challenge. Now, the way to run a Dryleaf build without infusing is a quality setup like we have here. But I wanted to try my favourite weapon infusion, so I went back to Redmane Castle for the Misbegotten Crucible fight, then out the front of the arena and turned right for the Red Hot Wet Blade. For the other infusion, I needed to get into Lane Dell. And this Draconic fight was, I think, the exact moment I fell in love with this weapon's charged attacks. In Lane Dell, I killed the Avatar for the extra Lord's Rune and headed into Godfrey. While the standard R1s work great for him as you would expect, tapped R2s are even better and can be sneaked into pretty much every single gap. More on that later. So the reason we're in Lane Dell is to get into the real round table hold, head up the scaffolding to the left of it, and into the second floor to grab the Sanctified Wet Blade, where you'd usually find the blacksmith. Now time to grab some old favourites. So a quick word on infusions. When I started this run, the plan was to switch between the Faith setup I'm building here and a Bleed Arcane setup with Braggart's Roar, which was originally the route that interested me the most with martial arts. However, after falling in love with the charged attacks, and knowing that Braggart's Roar would replace them, I wanted to see what these weapons were like without the obvious bleed setup. However, if you did want to go with a Braggart's Roar multi-hit arcane setup, like I used on the Claws video, I suspect it would be excellent for R1 spamming. For today though, we're respeccing to Faith. And I've always said that Gaius is the perfect boss for testing out new weapons to see what they're like. And I feel like this fight with Dryleaf Arts is the perfect advert for the boss and the versatility of martial arts. While I had all of my holy buffs equipped, I headed to the Cerulean coast to see the other Holy Week boss for some silly damage. Before heading back to the base game though, I thought I'd swap over to the fire setup. For the avatar, charged R2s, tapped R2s and jumping attacks are all great. But also, for large attack opportunities, the fully charged weapon art does some serious damage. I thought an attack this slow on such a fast weapon was a bit of a meme at first. However, the damage is actually really good. And for another easy fight with this amount of flame damage in the DLC, through the ancient ruins of Rao, grabbing the 3 shadow fragments on the way, and up to Romina. With a little bit of aggression and her low posture, it won't take long to start getting staggers. And speaking of posture damage, as I headed back to the base game, I wanted more of it. So I went to the Eastern Caelid avatar for the Stone Barbed Cracked Ear. Now for Morgoth. On your way to Fire Giant, you want to kill the Scarab after the bridge for a Somber 8. Then grab the Somber 9 on the bridge above the Snow Valley Ruins Grace. And I could have switched back to the Holy setup for Fire Giant here, but you just don't need to. Even though he's very fire resistant, this is still a very comfortable fight, which is surprising even when we're maxed out on damage. And once again, for the duo fight, despite the fire resistance, you still see damage that rivals the vast majority of runs on this channel. For Beastie Keth, get some charges in at the start, then play super aggressively with quick attacks to get the posture set up for Malekith. Now, I didn't have particularly high hopes for Gideon on a flame art martial arts setup. I thought this might take a while. However, for Godfrey, you want to start with tapped R2s until you get him to 80% health. Then stick to just R1 spamming to build up just enough posture damage. For Radagon, I'll just let this one play. For Elden Beast, once again, it's a case of surprisingly good damage and even more surprising posture damage. Now back to the DLC and down into the Abyssal Woods for Midra. And due to his low posture, this is just a case of repeatedly breaking it for riposte opportunities. The same is true for Messmer. While his posture is a little higher, Sneaking charges between all his combos is immensely satisfying, and if you're aggressive enough, you can keep that posture built up into phase 2 for an early stagger and less time dodging snakes. Now for a bit of build admin. I needed one more point in dexterity, so I headed to the Divine Lion to bully it for some cash. Complete Arnsbach and Theolier's questlines so they can join you in the final area. Now you may have noticed that I didn't kill Hornsent on this run, so the leather fight would be more difficult than usual. But despite this, I was very confident for 2 reasons. First off, the dry arts seem really good for NPC fights. Think of how many times Dane has stun-locked you to death. Maybe I could give him a taste of his own medicine. But the second and more important reason was that this was a faith build and I'd been picking up all of those cheeky Sombers throughout the run so I could level up the Sacred Relic Sword and cheese the living fuck out of them. So I suspected that the usual parry strats would be horrendous for the Radahn fight, as you'll get far less DPS than just fighting him normally. However, I thought I'd give it a shot and I immediately found a very satisfying way of doing it. Parry, tapped R2 for a kick. Parry kick, parry kick. When you get the stagger, another kick, a quick crouch, then into the riposte. It looks tight, but it never failed me. So it turns out even martial arts can work really effectively with a parry approach. And now it's time. And finally, Melania. With the fire damage doing its thing, I went for parries and charges when she stands up, the same as I would on a Giant Crusher build. And I think that generally sums up my thoughts on the Dryleaf Arts. When I started this run, I would have put Dryleaf Arts in a similar category to daggers, weapons that would always be at their best with a multi-hit bleed build set up and R1 spamming. However, after doing this run, I see them more like a straight-sword or a katana. Fast enough if you want to go for the spamming approach, but equally at home with charged attacks, breaking enemy posture more than you'd think. I guess there's a Dane's footwork bleed build needed for definitive proof, but I suspect this approach is way more fun. And that's it, how to make a martial arts build in Elden Ring. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more. As always, thanks for watching. See you soon.